Good afternoon, Board of Directors. My name is Jeannie Huang.
And I'm Vikram Singh. Together, we represent Insight Consulting.
We've been hired to provide recommendations on how Boeing can restore trust in the marketplace. And when we began to do that, we first looked at your mission statements and your values. The very first point was improving people's lives. See, Boeing technology brings people 39,000 feet in the air, traveling at hundreds of miles per hour. It's technology built on trust.
There are 6 main stakeholders affected by the MAX crisis. There's the Boeing employees, the pilots, the airlines, the regulators, the investors, and ultimately the consumers who end up flying the airplanes. If they don't feel safe, they will not fly a Boeing airplane.
And considering all these stakeholders, we have to look at stakeholder theory, which holds that firms must look beyond just profit, but at everyone that's impacted by the firm's decisions. See, we don't have to think of profit as a fixed pie, but rather one that can expand as value is added. And companies that historically do this generally do better in the long run.
Boeing was in competition with Airbus, and as a result, they released the MAX in 6 years rather than 7. As a result, cost, scope, and time were all constrained, which led to a lower quality product.
And this cost cutting didn't stop there. We see that it was actually integrated into Boeing's culture. Employees were consistently heaped with cost demands. When your engineers and when your software developers feel rushed, well, naturally the quality of that product will decline. That's when you get a shift from one of aerospace engineering to financial engineering.
As we know now, Boeing knew months before the MAX crisis that a cockpit alert was not working correctly. However, they didn't feel the need to tell this to airlines or regulators. They deemed it to be low risk. Moving forward, nothing is low risk at Boeing. Boeing has to be big about little things, as everything adds up in the long run. We also know now that Boeing has a conflict of interest with the FAA. Due to a long relationship of reliability and trust, Boeing has been granted much leeway with FAA regulations. In fact, Boeing employees serve on the FAA and then they regulate Boeing products. This is inherently a conflict of interest and a shortcut. And shortcuts are a slippery slope which lead to unethical behavior.
And there are important economic implications to consider in all of this. See, as regulators take that plane off the market, that reduces the supply of it. When airlines stop their orders and when consumers when consumers are more hesitant to buy your plane, that causes a decrease in the demand for that product. And this has effects on the US GDP. We see that Boeing is the largest US manufacturing exporter. And when Boeing performs negatively, the GDP also takes a hit. There are 4 critical regulations that Boeing was exempt from, given by the FAA, that no other plane in the aviation sky right now was given. These exemptions govern crew alerts warning pilots when something goes wrong. Now, this is another example of not being big about the small things, letting these small ethical mishaps turn one into another until it gets too big to control.
Boeing's initial response to the MAX crisis was late, impersonal, and mixed. It took 26 days after the second crash for Boeing to apologize. And when they did, the statement was very wooden and unemotional. On top of that, Boeing later said that they were technically following FAA regulations. But we know now that these FAA regulations were written with Boeing's interests in mind. Boeing was simply insincere. And by being insincere, they added disrespect on top of the original carelessness of the mistake that they made. That being said, Boeing has made strides in the right direction since then. They've created a Product and Services Safety Committee. However, it's very vague and no one really knows how it will work long term. They have also decided to have top engineers report to the chief engineer, which is also a good step, but this could also create a bottleneck effect where the chief engineer is overloaded with too much work. Finally, Mr. Muhlenberg has stepped down as chairman. This is a good example of strong corporate governance, as now he can focus solely on the MAX crisis and how to respond to it.
So how can Boeing restore trust in the marketplace? We've come up with 3 key recommendations for Boeing to follow. First, demonstrating radical transparency. Second, an extensive reform of the MCAS system and aviation standards. And third, spearheading an unmatched caliber of safety and innovation. This begins with demonstrating radical transparency. And that starts with admitting ownership of fault. Not just recognizing that a tragedy has occurred, but that we had a part in it, and that we have to take responsibility for how we contributed to that part. We have to be open to criticism and compassion about all that has occurred and make sure that we take moral responsibility for it. The next part to that is leveraging social media. In today's day and age, news travels in a flash. But Boeing News doesn't have to be negative. We have an opportunity to communicate directly to our stakeholders and show them and tell them how we're making these changes and how we're apologetic about what has occurred. And third, community engagement. Ethical direction begins at the top. So our executives have to conduct themselves with integrity and action-oriented steps. They should be visiting production sites and talking to employees directly to show how they're changing.
By the end of this month, your CEO will have to testify before Congress. Before he does this, he must appear on a public talk show so he can steer the conversation from one of guilt to one of honesty. And you may be wondering, when has radical transparency worked? Well, how many of you have had a headache and had to take a Tylenol pill? Did you think twice about taking it? Did you doubt if it was safe?
Let me ask you this. If you had to book a flight right now, you saw that it was a 737 MAX, would you have doubts? Would you think twice? Well, according to surveys conducted, 70% of U.S. customers would be hesitant to ride on a Boeing 737 aircraft.
In 1982, Boeing had a product that technically, in 1982, Johnson & Johnson had a product that technically met FAA regulations. And as we know now, Boeing had a product that technically met FAA regulations. Johnson & Johnson's product had a key design flaw, as did the Boeing's airplane. And in both cases, there's a tragic loss of life. However, Johnson & Johnson immediately issued a recall and created a new industry standard tamper-resistant container within 6 weeks. It is now Boeing's job to follow Johnson & Johnson's playbook and create the new standard for aviation safety.
The second part of our recommendation is an extensive reform of the MCAS system and the aviation standards. The first step to that is reviewing the MCAS system, what actually went wrong to begin with. Boeing has to prove that its products are safe. That means pilots have to be able to override that system, and when it's released in the market, it needs to account for any errors that can possibly occur. Pilots, airlines, and regulators all need to have a comprehensive understanding of it. That way that we can see that the culture of Boeing changes, and we can see what actually led to the MCAS system.
Boeing should also push for a documented process of flight manual information, and they should encourage the safety community to share the results worldwide with each other. This leads to our final strategy, which is spearheading unmatched caliber of safety and innovation.
When you're carrying people, you can't cut costs. That's why it's crucial that Boeing vets its quality and control processes to make sure that these safety measures are put in place and that there's safety oversight throughout the entire processes. That's why we should have an engineer join you, the board of directors, to make sure that safety is integrated from top to bottom. And that way employees feel that they're more open to be able to probe at any issues and any safety concerns that they may have.
Boeing should also make sure that pilots feel comfortable at all times. Pilots should have comprehensive and up-to-date information about Boeing aircraft, whether that's from safety information or to emergency information. Boeing should also create a safety committee advisor composed of independent and credible engineers, pilots, ethicists, physicists outside the company. By getting a committee outside the company to put input on Boeing products, this reduces bias and restores trust in the marketplace.
16.8 billion passengers. That's the amount of passengers that have rode on a Boeing 737 to date. And it's been that way because Boeing technology is meant to improve people's lives, progress them, bring them to further heights they never thought possible.
Through a commitment to ethical excellence, safety, and people, Boeing will be able to fly billions more. Thank you for your time.
Okay, so now we're going to move into our Q&A session. I'm going to hand the microphone to Mr. Russ Johnson, who's the chair of our Center for Leadership Ethics. And so I'll hand it over to you, Russ.
On the screen is one of Boeing's enduring values, safety. We value human life and well-being above all else and take action accordingly. We are personally responsible and collectively accountable for safety at all levels for our teammates, our passengers, and those who service our products. Boeing's corporate culture has been cited as a root cause of the MAX 37 crisis and for not adhering to Boeing's values. Two-part question. Why? And identify 3 changes that could be implemented by leadership at Boeing to bolster an ethical corporate culture.
Can you say the second part to that question one more time?
Sure. Identify 3 changes that could be implemented by leadership at Boeing to bolster an ethical corporate culture.
So because of the competition from Airbus, and because of Airbus was making those changes to their plane, were able to bring that to market, Boeing had pressure to bring it to market quickly as well, which ended up creating that cost-cutting culture that we saw, because they had that pressure to bring it out as quickly as possible, and that limited the time that they were able to bring it to market.
And the power plant where they make the Boeing airplanes, the South Carolina plant, as a result of the cost-cutting mandate, it had several quality control issues, and it caused increased regulatory oversight by federal authorities.
And these FAA regulations that were given to them were little small steps that they could see as shortcuts to get that part out quicker, which caused missteps in seeing where safety might not have been considered. So the 3 changes that we would recommend to Boeing to make sure to implement is first, making sure that they are having quality control safety checks throughout their entire system throughout their entire corporate culture. The second is making sure that there's an engineer on the board of directors as well, so that safety is implemented from the top to the bottom. And third, having that credible advisor of safety committee of advisors that are independent of the firm and can give a credible and objective view of the safety standards that we're putting out to market.
So with the second point, which is having an engineer on the board of directors. Recently, because Boeing moved to South Carolina, they moved because the governor convinced them to be a good move for the company. And Governor Nikki Haley ended up at the board of directors at Boeing. And a lot of critics say that they should have also added an engineer to the board of directors. By adding an engineer to the board of directors, when a crisis like this happens, Boeing will not take a long time to respond. It took them 26 days. An engineer will know right away when something is wrong, and they will care more about what engineers have to say than about just focusing only on profit.
And the quality and safety control protocols will help reinstate that, because then it makes Boeing become the Volvo and the Mercedes of the aviation industry. Companies that don't just meet safety standards, but they set the bar for them. So that last point about the credible committee of safety advisors, that's going to be composed of people like physicists, ethicists, outside sources that we can get information from, and credible information to see and make sure that our entire process is not biased and going into market with safety considered.
And when it comes to fixing a problem, Boeing should not try to do it completely by itself. By hiring a third party to investigate their procedures, it ensures that there's an outside perspective and it shows to the rest of the world that there's not as much bias involved and that the motive is not solely on profit, but also on the safety of the consumers that fly on Boeing aircraft.
Round of applause to the